today's event, we'll be discussing Vijay's latest book, published in August this year, On Cuba, which was co-authored with Noam Chomsky. So I think without further ado, I'll welcome Vijay up to the stage.
Okay, such a formal-looking auditorium. I hope I can do justice to this room. But, first, thanks a lot to the Cuba Friendship Society. It's so important. It's hard to say, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Every day there's a crisis in the Cuban Revolution. And we're just sort of coming out of a crisis, I suppose, with the electricity. But it's like day after day. And in a way, the solidarity networks, that used to be there are not as vigorous as they could be. And partly everywhere I go, I feel a little disheartened that our numbers are depleting. Those who are committed to the Cuban Revolution, our numbers are depleting. And it's not only the numbers that are depleting, but the sense of understanding why the Cuban Revolution is so important is also, to some extent, fading. I think as the generations go on, it's very hard to explain to people the importance of the Cuban Revolution. And that's really one of the reasons why basically I forced Noam Chomsky to do this book with me. It was actually an interesting way that it happened. And I think I'll tell you that I'm just going to tell you a bunch of disconnected stories, okay? Because that's how I like talking about Cuba. Cuba is a series of disconnected stories. Anybody who's been there knows what I'm talking about. You'll meet somebody with one story. You'll meet somebody with another, a third person with another. And in your head, you start to put together this incredible thing called the Cuban Revolution. Because the Cuban Revolution isn't something that happens with Fidel. It happens with all the 11 million Cubans who have different stories, and you have to patch it together. It's a pretty extraordinary experience for those who've been to Cuba, and I really hope for those who haven't been that they'll go on some of these solidarity trips to Cuba that the Australian Cuba Friendship Society organizes. I'm sure many of you have already been there. I've known Noam Chomsky for about 30 plus years. And we've had an interesting relationship because we don't agree on everything. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Leninist. And Noam has no sense really of, he doesn't like the Soviet Union. And I'm not even sure that Noam really thinks that the October Revolution is important. Important historically, but not perhaps for the reasons that I think it was important. But one of the great things about friendship in the left is that it teaches you not to allow your minor differences, in many cases, to get in the way of building together. Because, absolutely for sure, we are both against the menace of US imperialism. Absolutely for sure, we are both absolutely against the ravages of capitalism. There's so much that people on the left have in common, and yet our history has been one of seeking the smallest divide in order to split ourselves, break apart, and weaken our movements. And in fact, in the process, really disorient the working class, which doesn't always follow the intricacies of splits and so on. When I was a young militant in our movement and in the trade union movement, half the time when I went door to door in the trade union areas, people didn't know which Communist Party I came from. It didn't seem to matter because they knew me. I was, more important to them because we had a personal relationship than which of the strands of the movement I was coming from. That always taught me the importance of friendship and the importance of being there, being a constant presence in the centrality of the class struggle. Well, with Chomsky, we developed a friendship where over time it was harder and harder for him to travel, and I used to, in a way, travel for him. So I would go to Iraq, for instance, and report from Iraq and send him emails and so on. And he used to send me his, fulminations at the New York Times, how they were reporting the same things. I would be, sitting in Libya, and he would be so frustrated saying, "This is the New York Times headline on Libya." And, that didn't bother me because the New York Times anyway is a piece of garbage. Don't take it seriously. They have a hard time saying simple things like Israel bombed Palestine. It's always Palestinians who die in passive voice. 20 Palestinians died. When an Israeli dies, it's an active voice. Hamas killed Israelis. But somehow Palestinians just have the bad luck of just dying in the middle of bombs falling all over them. It's always in passive voice. It's a garbage newspaper. But, Noam would get upset. We developed this relationship over the years. I would go see him, and he would talk with great feeling about US foreign policy. Well, during the pandemic, his publisher asked, would he and I do a book together on the withdrawal of the United States military from Afghanistan, Iraq, and, he didn't mention Libya at the time. So we started this, endeavor of talking to each other for hours and hours in a day, 2-3 hours in the day. And he was already in his 90s. His prodigious memory, it was absolutely incredible. He'd remember some article in some newspaper published in Long Island that had some story that was important, an article from 1991. He'd remember it, but not exactly. Like, he wouldn't remember the author, but he remembered the context. And then I would go and find the article, and then we'd come back to it and so on. That's the book that we did called The Withdrawal, which, is not really a transcript of a conversation. It's a curated book. When the book came out in Spanish, I went to Cuba, and I went to see Silvio Rodriguez, who's a great singer, and I hope you like his music, one of the greatest singers of his generation. He has a wonderful studio in Havana called Ojala. And so I went to see him to give him a copy of the Spanish book because he's an enormous Noam Chomsky fan. And when I gave him the book, unfortunately for me, Silvio gave me a giant, heavy book that he had made on Cuban progressive music. It was just an enormous book. And, I love getting gifts from people, but a huge, giant book on Cuban music, which he wanted me to give to Chomsky, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. So I go to see Chomsky, and I said, I brought a gift from Silvio Rodriguez. And Chomsky says, "Who is that?" If I said I've got a book from Bob Dylan, he would have said, "Who is that?" He has no idea about things that happen outside that narrow bandwidth of things he's interested in. So I was like, I carried this fucking book from Cuba for you, and you're like, who is this? Anyway, but that actually spurred on a conversation about Cuba. And I asked him, I said, I never really knew, when did you first go to Cuba? And interestingly, he didn't go to Cuba till 2004. And at the time, he went for a conference, and he started to tell me this story about Ricardo Alarcón, who passed away a few years ago. Alarcón was a really tremendous man, and I think he had been to Australia. He was the president of the National Assembly, super bright man, very interested in engaging with people. So Chomsky started telling me this story about how he had met Alarcón, and they had gone on national TV in Cuba live. So they're on live national TV in Havana. He's with the head of the National Assembly, and Chomsky starts asking him about political prisoners. He won't let it go. He just keeps coming. It's live TV. The broadcast continues. There's no cutting the feed. They just let it go. And Alarcón responds to him and explains, this is our position. This is how we see things. If you want to overthrow the government, well, that's not politically acceptable. Whatever. He had his arguments. The end of the program, he shook his hand. Next day, Alarcón sends a message to Chomsky, says, we would like you to come and address the National Assembly. Everybody's going to be there. We want you to come and address. So the next day, Chomsky goes to the National Assembly and he talks about political prisoners. And he says how he is absolutely confounded by any society that has political, etc. And because it's a conversation with Alarcon makes his point again. Now, 20 years later, Chomsky relates this story to me, and he says, do you know what's interesting about the story? It's not that I said those things about political prisoners, because he's an anarchist. He believes that the world can be created out of candy floss or something, there's no hard realities. Some people just have to go to jail. I mean, there's a reality in the world, and I'm sorry about that, and I hate that. I wish too that everybody could be free and so on. There are some things, if you're going to go and try to assassinate Fidel Castro, well, there has to be some consequence for that. I suppose you could go into rehabilitation and so on. And people yell at me and say you're for the genocide in Xinjiang. Well, but they're trying to rehabilitate people. I don't get what the problem is here. They're not destroying the Uyghur population like the Yanks destroyed Iraq. That's just not happening. So let's have some perspective. Anyway, he tells me this, and he goes on at length, and then he says to me, in all my 90 years and 70 years of active political work from the 1960s, I have never been on any US television channel. Not even the Boston local television channel. Never. Never been on a US television channel. Not even a pre-recorded show. And then he said once the local radio station had got some academic from another college to review one of his books. The academic taped the review in the studio. He read it out. They were ready to go, and he had been told there's going to be a review of your book, and he was quite excited. Okay, this is Noam Chomsky world. They make little garden gnomes with his face on them. Yeah? He was excited that there's going to be a review read on a local radio station in Boston. He tunes in, the program runs, no review. Turns out they pulled the review, this local station, just before he went on air. So he said to me, what's interesting is that I've never been on TV, but in Cuba they let me speak and say all this stuff about political prisoners on national TV live, didn't cut the feed, and the next day Alarcon takes me to the National Assembly, knowing full well that obstinate me is going to ask the same question. That's Cuba for you. That's the dictatorship. That's what it's like. And I think it's important to recognize that, because that was the basis of our book that we did. We did a conversation, didn't work out, ended up, we talked through things, we put it together, and we made a manuscript. And then, sadly he fell ill, and it was hard for him to then do any publicity on the book or anything. But I think he was pretty happy with the product that we made. And we made this basically as a love letter to the Cuban Revolution, because he and I both agree that it's one of the most fundamental acts of liberation that have taken place in the Americas, in that whole hemisphere. One of the most fundamental acts of liberation that have taken place and have attempted to sustain themselves. A very important political act. Now, one of the things that came out of our conversation, which I thought was quite interesting, was one day I brought up to him in the conversation that when C.L.R. James was writing a new afterword to his really terrific 1938 book, The Black Jacobins, James decided to make a comparison and talk about revolutions in the Caribbean. The book, The Black Jacobins, is about the Haitian Revolution of 1804, led by Toussaint Louverture. It's quite a brilliant book, The Black Jacobins. I really recommend it. You can have whatever differences you want with C.L.R. James, but that book is really extraordinary. He did in fact write a play version of it in the late 30s and had Paul Robeson play the role of Toussaint Louverture. And I wish they had film cameras there. What I would give to watch Robeson playing Toussaint Louverture. I mean, that's something else. At any rate, so C.L.R. James in the early 1960s is writing an afterword. And the afterword is titled From Toussaint Louverture to Fidel Castro. Because what James argues is that this is a Caribbean spirit, that the Cuban Revolution is in the spirit of the Haitian Revolution. So I mentioned that to Chomsky. I said, isn't that an interesting comparison? And we started talking about it. And then after I hung up from that phone call, I realized, wait a minute, there's in fact a clearer comparison than the Haitian Revolution. It's what happens in Haiti 2 years before the Cuban Revolution, and I just want to put it together. There's a section in this book on that comparison. It's pretty interesting. So 2 years before the revolution in Cuba in 1959, 2 years before, in 1957, there's a counter-revolution that takes place in Haiti when Papa Doc Duvalier overthrows the democratic process that had struggled to come out of a US occupation, and he creates a dictatorship in 1957. Papa Doc Duvalier is succeeded by his son, Baby Doc Duvalier. That dictatorship goes till almost 1990, almost. That dictatorship is famous for extreme violence against the population. They created death squads backed by the United States. The United States gave the Haitian counter-revolution political backing for its entire period, from 57 till about almost 1980. That's a very long period of allowing a vicious dictatorship where almost every human rights organization had written some kind of denunciation of what they were doing. You may have heard of the phrase Tanton Macots and things like that, the death squads that operated. The Lavalas movement of Jean-Bertrand Aristide emerges in the aftermath of that dictatorship. That's 1957. 2 years later, there's the Cuban Revolution. Now, it's an interesting and opposite comparison because the Cuban Revolution liberates the population, tries to produce sovereignty for this small island in the middle of the Caribbean, fights against foreign intervention, defends itself from foreign intervention. You don't have death squads in Cuba. On the other side, they arm the people in the committees in defense of the revolution to establish the island's sovereignty. But the United States government spends all those decades trying to protect the counter-revolution in Haiti and to overthrow the revolution in Cuba. Strikes me that that comparison is the most illuminating comparison to help understand US foreign policy. It is the best comparison because these are two small islands, one of them a brutal, vicious dictatorship which nobody can defend. It's virtually impossible to mount a defense of Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvalier, and yet the United States treated it as a liberated country. It's extraordinary. Meanwhile, the Cuban Revolution, the full support of the people, and they tried to overthrow it and kill Fidel Castro hundreds of times, never trying to kill Papa Doc or Baby Doc. They were immune. This tells you a lot about US foreign policy. The second thing that comes clear in this book is why was the United States so upset with Cuba? I mean, the Cuban population today is 11 million. You know, it's less than the population of New York City. What's your problem? Just let them do what they want to do. They want to try to build socialism, take it easy. They are not bothering you. They're just 11 million people. United States, 320 million people. Cuba is not going to try to invade the US. I mean, they never had any ambition to send, some Guevaraist Foco to Florida to go and try and make a revolution. The United States is not in a position to have that kind of revolution. The Cubans are not crazy. Even Guevara, in all his search for the next Cuba, he went to the center of Africa to try it in the Congo. He tried it a little bit in Tanzania. He tested the waters. And then he eventually goes to Bolivia, where he meets his untimely death. I'm always grateful to my parents for birthing me about maybe 6 months before he was killed. So I can at least say that I shared oxygen with Che Guevara. Unlike some people here, lots of you shared oxygen. I know, I can see your gray hair, but some people don't know what it feels like to be alive when Che Guevara was on the planet Earth. how good that felt. I'm going to tell you later about some of my Fidel stories because those are pretty funny. Especially the last meeting with Fidel was quite hilarious. Anyway, why were they so freaked out about Cuba? Like, what is it? And so, you always think, oh, it's the communism or it's something like, it's not that. We went back and forth on this and it became quite clear. I haven't read the US State Department record as well as Chomsky has read it. So he, from memory, was telling me, well, in this book, you'll find that in that 1963 document. He didn't remember the quote, but he knew where to go. And I went and found all the material. And I was like, man, this guy's memory, age 94, he remembered the foreword to this book has this line. And I thought, how the hell do you remember this? Extraordinary man. I mean, really, I went to visit him just a couple of months ago. He's extraordinary. Half his body is not in great shape, but with the other half, he still plays with his dog. He has a dog called Gus. I mean, why do you name the dog Gus? Gus was one of the last leaders of the US Communist Party, Gus Hall. Maybe that was Noam Chomsky's tribute to old Gus Hall, who was a great union organizer. Who knows? I doubt it, though. So don't get excited, my old comrades. Don't get excited. I don't think it's a real tribute. I think in my head that it's a tribute to Gus Hall. Gus Hall once gave a speech to, I'm making fun of Gus Hall, but he was a much better communist than I. But he once gave a speech where he was talking about national health care. And right through the speech, he kept saying national hair care, which appealed to me a great deal because in those days, I had a lot of hair when I was listening to him thinking, that's a great idea. We have, all the hair salons should be nationalized. And when we were talking about this, he remembered these sections from John Adams, the record of early US presidents talking about Cuba. And this is long before Fidel Castro was born. So this is not about communism. This feeling about Cuba goes back. And just because I was really curious about this, I read a book called The River of Dark Dreams, which is about the slavery economists, the political economists of slavery, who wrote about the Mississippi River. Because the Mississippi River comes down right through the center of the United States, a beautiful giant river, comes into New Orleans and then out into the Caribbean, where in the mouth of the Mississippi is Cuba and these other islands, including Haiti. The Haitian Revolution terrified the enslavers of the United States and even all the way out to Brazil, scared them because it set a precedent that the enslaved people could rise up and overthrow slavery. That's why they tried to garrote and crush the Haitian Revolution from the beginning. But that desire to crush the Haitian Revolution comes with another fantasy, which is this economy that would go from the Mississippi River into the Caribbean, and the islands of the Caribbean, especially Cuba, would be an entrepot. It would be the Singapore of slavery, in the Caribbean. It's from there that the goods would go everywhere. They had this vision of that whole region. And so the American presidents wrote from at least 1823, from the Monroe Doctrine onwards, they imagined Cuba being part of the United States. So John Adams says, it's right in the beginning of the book, that Cuba will fall into our hands like a ripe apple falls from a tree. They wanted Cuba from the beginning. They waited in a way till 1898 when the uprising starts across the Spanish colonial territory from the Philippines to Hawaii to Cuba, Puerto Rico and so on, the so-called War of Independence. There's so many interesting stories about that War of Independence. United States inserts itself on the side of the insurgents. Like Jose Marti's dream of the independent Cuba. US inserts itself, and then as they come to independence, does what all old colonial forces do, set aside the independence leadership and takes power. They did that in the Philippines, they seized Puerto Rico, they seized Cuba in 1898. Well, having finally, now the apple was ripe, as Adam said, 70, 75 years before then, it fell into their laps. It became part of America. And eventually, as you know, from having watched Godfather Part 2, it becomes a gangster's paradise. And, all the gangsters move there. And Cuba is essentially a playground for the wealthy. It gets reduced to that. It's that actually infuriates Fidel Castro and sets up now a dialectic between the United States vision of Cuba as effectively the playground of wealth, the playground of capitalism. You'll have to remember that when the Cuban Revolution happened, the gangsters who had built hotels in Cuba moved to Las Vegas, and they built Las Vegas after the fall of Cuba. I mean, Las Vegas was a child of the Cuban Revolution. They go from Cuba, hounded out of Cuba to Miami, and eventually they go to Las Vegas and build that in Nevada. That's actually a child of the Cuban Revolution. I once said that to a union organizer who unionizes gambling workers in Las Vegas, and he had a great laugh. I said, you should tell all your members that we are a product of the Cuban Revolution as much as what's happening in Cuba, because they sent all the gangsters to us, and now we have this ridiculous city in the middle of a desert that really shouldn't be there, that absorbs so much water. I went there once. It is the most hideous sight, and it should be illegal that they have this ghastly city of, all kinds of, but that was what Havana was. If you want to know what Havana was before 1959, it was Las Vegas, but at a different level of technology. Why did the Cuban Revolution bother them? Because first, they felt entitled to Cuba. Cuba was theirs. It was part of the United States. It was theirs, like they see Puerto Rico as theirs, regardless of how little Puerto Rico matters to the US. I mean, when there was a Hurricane Mitch destroyed Puerto Rico, they waited 2 years to fix the electricity. Puerto Rico doesn't really matter to the United States, but it holds on to it. It's theirs. So is Cuba. It's theirs. Don't underestimate that kind of narrow thinking. It's their land, and they will have it by hook or by crook. When it's ripe, it'll fall into their hands. And what the Cuban Revolution does is interesting. I often say that the United States has no problem with Cuba. You should not mistake. It doesn't have a problem with the Cuban people. It has a problem with the Cuban Revolution. It's a political thing. It's not a national question. They don't care about. They don't have a dispute with Cuba. They would like to have Cuba be free in its own way. They don't have a problem with Venezuela. They have a problem with the Bolivarian process. It's a political thing. They have a problem with the Cuban Revolution. Why? Because, and here are the two words that appear over and over again in the State Department documents, in conversations of the presidents with their advisors. Two words, recur, and we chart it over and over again. The first word is disobedience. Cuba is disobedient. Cuba is a disobedient child. Children are disobedient. Adults are not really considered disobedient. I don't know. I generally think of it as a child is disobedient. Cuba is disobedient. What is it not obeying? It's not obeying the great master up north, El Norte. It's not obeying that Washington orders that come routinely. It's disobedient. That's the first word. Cuba is disobedient. And secondly, contagion. The disobedience is contagious. If Cuba can get away with being disobedient, so can other countries. That's why they wanted to garrote the Cuban Revolution. And in fact, on both counts, the United States has been correct. Cuba is disobedient. The Cuban Revolution is structured as disobedience because it says we want to establish our sovereignty. And that's the interesting thing. Forget socialism. Forget communism, Marxism, everything. What we learned from Marx and Engels, from the German ideology, is that communism is the actual movement of history. It's not that, Fidel and the other fellas imposed communism on Cuba. They did something quite simple. If you go back and read history will absolve me, 1953, yeah, his statement to the court, why would any court have allowed that man to speak? Why would you allow him to speak? They were crazy. They gave Fidel all the time in the world. If you read that speech, it goes on and on forever. Just like Fidel was the greatest man I've ever met in my life. He could talk about anything. One day, something about science and technology, genetic engineering, environment. You know, the guy was a prodigious learner, curious. Yeah, but also knew everything. Chomsky said, yes, we had an address from Fidel at that conference and he talked about everything. And I said, yeah, but Noam, he's not there for you. He's the greatest teacher of the Cuban people. You know, people complain, Fidel speaks for 3-4 hours. They don't have any problem when they go to a university lecture hall. And the lecturer, like, you know, I'm just getting going. I'm like a 3-hour guy myself, yeah? So, I don't know what the agenda was. Huh? Okay. So, I mean, people, I've seen him speak, like some of you have as well, seen him speak in Havana. You know, people come there and he explained the conjuncture to people who don't have the advantage of, you know, whatever, like, you know, some sort of advanced learning. He was the professor. He explained the conjuncture. He also talked to lots of people, absorbed things, explained the conjuncture. So, it's not like Fidel showed up and said, let's establish socialism. No, they did something quite precise. 1953, you read his speech to the court, and you see that in that speech, he says exactly what they're going to do. And they do exactly what that speech says, which is they're going to establish the sovereignty of Cuba. That we don't want a big multinational company charging us electricity rates 3 times the average on other islands. Simple. We're going to say, no, this is what we pay. We want to take control of our resources, including sugarcane. We don't want the big plantation owners running things. Simple things. It's exactly what Jacob Arbenz had done in Guatemala. Jacob Arbenz was a liberal, not a radical. Arbenz's wife was a Marxist. She was best friends with the leader of the Communist Party of Guatemala, but Arbenz himself was a liberal. He was no Marxist. All he said was, United Fruit Company, in which the CIA director and his brother, who was the Secretary of State of the United States, had shares in the United Fruit Company, big, large blocks of shares. And if you ever go to Washington, D.C., you'll have the misfortune of landing in Dulles Airport, which is named after the two brothers. And if your plane doesn't go there, you'll have the even greater misfortune of landing in the Reagan Airport. It's one of the most hideous airport structures in the United States because it's either Reagan or Dulles. Either way, you know, it's a bad choice. Yeah. So Arbenz, who wasn't a socialist, he just said, United Fruit, we're going to take some of your land, which you're not using, and we're going to give it to the campesinos, landless peasants. That's all we're going to do. Not allowed. Coup. They stripped him naked in the airport as he was leaving Guatemala City. He goes to Mexico City, he dies in his bathtub. Most likely killed himself. His wife believed he was assassinated. I think probably he killed himself. He was humiliated. Arbenz was not a radical. Che Guevara was in Guatemala City during the coup d'etat against Arbenz. And he made it very clear, he wrote about it, talked about it to his friends, that we are going to get hit by them if we try to establish sovereignty in Cuba. Therefore, we have to be prepared. We have to go to the people, explain. We have to arm the people with ideas. And we have to arm the people to defend against a coup d'etat. And that's what the Cubans did. They tried to establish their sovereignty. That was the biggest act of disobedience. Nothing there was outside what Arbenz had tried to do. Nothing. Nothing there was outside what Mohammad Mossadegh had tried to do in Iran in 1953, the year before the coup against Arbenz, where Mossadegh said, we're going to control our oil. It cost $1 million. The grandson of Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt, was the CIA agent on the ground, and he ran the operation. It cost them $1 million, which is nothing, to get rid of the government of Mohammad Mossadegh. All these people were doing the same thing at that time. These are third world attempts to establish sovereignty. There were coups everywhere. The Cubans knew that. They had to defend themselves against that reality. Why did they arm the people? Because that was the reality. Why did they imprison political prisoners? That was the reality. They were going to get couped if they didn't defend themselves against what the US was doing elsewhere. You'll ask the question, why didn't you establish a liberal democracy? Look at Guatemala. Why didn't you establish a liberal democracy? Look at Iran. That was the reality. They were not playing in a playground where everybody had rules that they followed. There was a brutal country ready to use every and any means to overthrow their government. That was the reality. That was the Cuban Revolution. From the day they took power in Havana till today, they are being suffocated by one of the most powerful countries in the world. Till today, till now, till tomorrow. And we are not doing enough to give them relief. We have not built a strong enough solidarity movement to give them relief. I met Fidel Castro many times. The last time was a few years before he died. And it was interesting. And I'm going to tell you the story because it tells you something about the person. We were talking about various things. When I was leaving, he said to me, stop smoking. It's interesting. Fidel Castro stopped smoking in the early 60s. Those pictures of him with the cigar are all anachronistic. He never smoked for most of his life. He smoked in the early years in the Sierra Maestra, but he stopped smoking in Havana. And then he said, stop smoking, stop drinking. And I'm thinking, man, you're like the country that produces cigars. You're the country that produces some of the best rum in the world. Every time I come here, I buy like 2 bottles of your Havana Club and I buy like 1,000 mini Cohibas. And you, my great hero, my leader forever till I die, in a tracksuit. Yeah, who has a tracksuit? You want to see Fidel in his military outfit? There he is in some sort of knockoff Adidas tracksuit and wearing slippers with his tracksuit, telling me, stop smoking, stop drinking. Yeah, and then the coup de grace. He says, it's not what you're thinking. He says, drink moringa tea. Because the interesting thing about Fidel, and in a sense the Cuban Revolution, is these people always experimented. They tried all kinds of things. That's how they developed these incredible pharmaceutical processes, or how they survived the special period. They developed a way of fertilizer without chemicals. And then they discovered new ways to be healthy. He discovered drinking this god-awful thing called moringa tea, which you can buy here as well in health food stores. He claims that it's what kept him alive and his brain functioning very well. I just think it's because it was all the water that he kept himself hydrated, drinking cups of this god-awful tea that apparently kept him alive. But every time you talk to a person like that, or other members of the Cuban party, what's interesting is their creativity. They are not dogmatic people. I find that immensely attractive. They want to learn things. They want to hear what's happening in different countries. They have an immense appetite for internationalism. And that's the final point I want to make. Immense appetite for internationalism. They are creative, always looking for new ways to solve problems around the world and including in their country. Look at the way they handled the COVID pandemic, probably better than Australia. I don't know how Australia handled it, but I doubt that Australia created 5 vaccine candidates, in no time at all. And that was the ingenuity of their scientific establishment. Really, really smart people. But it's that internationalism, that commitment to the international, which is extraordinary. Like, how do 11 million people who are struggling to hold on to their revolution, struggling to survive really, how do they get this commitment to go out there and help other people? During the COVID people, I talked to a doctor, Cuban doctor. She was in a hot ward, that means a COVID ward in Costa Rica. Young woman in her early 30s. I asked her, why are you here? She was telling me about her daughter who lives in Oriente, and because it was a pandemic, she, Skypes them, but doesn't get to see them much. And by the way, it's really hard to communicate with Cuba because it's not that Cuba blockades the internet. It's that the internet is blockaded for them. They would like to use Zoom, but Zoom is blocked for them. Zoom doesn't allow access to Cuba. There's a lot of, when they talk about freedom and democracy and internet freedom in particular, it's not that Cuba is blocking things, that they are not allowing the Cubans to use these mechanisms. Anyway, she says to me, I'm here because I believe that we have to take the best of our revolution to other countries. We have to help them. They don't have medical facilities and so on. And I was listening to her thinking, my God, firstly, the US State Department had just released a report saying that Cuban doctors were basically being kidnapped by the state and being sent abroad and forced to work. They were forced labor, and that whatever they were earning was being sent back for foreign exchange in Cuba. But the thing is, I did an event with about 5 doctors and Danny Glover around that time. And all these doctors came on the webinar and they talked about what they were doing. Some of them I had met before. And I was puzzled by the US State Department report. Like, it's so distant from reality, and yet it sits there as a credible text. It was so credible that entire world media reported that Cuban doctors are basically kidnapped and being used by the state to raise funds and so on. And the Cuban doctors that I met around the time this report came were so frustrated that their story couldn't come out. They couldn't somehow break through this propaganda that was really eating into them because they felt disrespected by the story that the United States government was telling about them. Completely disrespected, like their own integrity was on the line. Just after doing those interviews with Cuban doctors, I was thinking in great pain actually about how Cuba had been put back on the US State Department terrorist list, the state sponsors of terrorism. Now, these things sound kind of odd to our ears. State Department puts Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list. It sounds a little absurd. But in fact, the impact of this is extraordinary. It's not trivial. It's a non-trivial impact on the Cuban people, because this really prevents third-party companies from coming in and doing trade with Cuba. Like shipping companies refuse to carry goods in and out of Cuba because this particular sanction and then the Trump's 243 sanctions have especially hardened the embargo against the island. And if it were not for the bravery of Mexico, Venezuela, Russia, and a handful of other countries, the Cuban Revolution would have just collapsed. And I often ask people in Cuba, what would it be like if the Cuban Revolution collapses? Even those who are very critical of the government led by Miguel Díaz-Canel. I ask people that all the time. They tell me, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. I just ask them, what do you think it would be like? And they said, one of the tragedies we face now is if the Cuban Revolution falls, we will go back to 1958. We will not advance to 2025. Cuba's clock will be rewound and we go back to 58. And we don't want to go back to 58. We don't want to remain in an embargo, a permanent state of revolutionary siege, counter-revolutionary siege. We don't want to remain in this. We'd like to break out of this. But on the other hand, if this collapses, we go to 58. What we would like to do is to advance our revolutionary agenda. We cannot do this with the blockade. I'm bringing you this book because I really want to help strengthen the Cuba solidarity movement overseas. Internationalism with Cuba. Cuba has shown itself to be a great international partner of the world. It was because of the Cuban Revolution that apartheid fell in South Africa. It was because of the Cuban Revolution that so many people were saved from COVID-19. It's because of the Cuban Revolution that people even in Australia are learning how to read. The Cuban Revolution has given us a lot. What are we going to give the Cuban Revolution? Thanks a lot. Well, I don't know exactly why Chomsky is positive about the Cuban Revolution compared to the Soviet Revolution, but I'll give it a try. I never asked the question directly because I didn't want to start a conversation about the Soviet Union, which, generally I don't like to have debates with people about differences like that. I mean, I don't know. I just didn't want to go there. But I can actually envision why. There is something about the defiance of Cuba that's very attractive to everybody. There is a big giant bully in the playground, and then there's this person who's just saying, no, I'm not going to bend. It's like, it's incredible, the fortitude. For so long, I'm just not going to go. And I must say that this has traveled over the generations. That it's not that the first generation had the most, clear idea of why they were resisting. This has gone across the generations. It is also true that there are lots of young Cubans who are frustrated with, permanent resistance. Just as there are lots of young Palestinians that I've met in the various camps who are frustrated with a lifetime of struggle. It's one thing to say, well, in Palestine, the word smooth is so important. Steadfastness, yeah? So important. But so people have to be steadfast for their whole life. It's not, I'm going to go on strike for a month or 5 days. This is generations of people are struggling for liberation and emancipation in Palestine. Imagine it's similar in Cuba. Generations of people have been fighting against a suffocating embargo, the blockade, right? So it's hard to understand sometimes how people are able to withstand these attacks and this force and so on. But it's so interesting. They moved to a new generation of leadership. It seemed to be pretty seamless. I would really hate to be in the shoes of Miguel Díaz-Canel, because to follow Fidel is not an easy issue. It's like the issue for Nicolas Maduro to follow Hugo Chavez. It's just not easy. I mean, Chavez came to India in 2015. Sorry, not, of course not. 2006. And I was there traveling with them as a reporter. And man, this guy was amazing. It's like there are people who are amazing. Fidel was amazing. Chavez was incredible. Fidel was amazing. What a character. You don't see people like that often in life. Yeah? An amazing character. Can you imagine following Fidel taking over the presidency of the country? So Miguel Díaz-Canel makes it his own presidency. He's a blue jeans wearer. You never see him in military fatigues. Yeah? He likes rock and roll music. I mean, it's a different generation, It's hard to continue with fortitude or struggle. I know that that's what impressed somebody like Chomsky from an anarchist tradition, because of the fortitude, that they kept standing up. I mean, Noam Chomsky, age 95, pilloried right till the end. I'm scared. I saw when they said he died, I don't know if you remember this, twice in a row. It was very distressing for his family. Twice in a row they said he died, and his obituaries came out. Yanis Varoufakis published an obituary. I enjoyed reading it. It was a bit odd to read an obituary. I mean, it's something that I guess people might enjoy, reading their obituary just to check to see what it would be like. But there was no, I mean, I got a call from the New York Times saying, is he really dead? Because we're going to run an obituary. And I said, no, he's not, he's alive. Thanks for trying to confirm it, but you should have called his family, not me. Anyway, but I can understand because he has been attacked his whole life. And when we did the withdrawal, I asked him, it's in the withdrawal, I asked him, how do you deal with all these attacks on you? And he said, well, I'm arrogant. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wish I had that level of arrogance, and to even say I'm arrogant is hilarious. But in one sense, that's the Cuban Revolution. It just doesn't wilt, It has a strength, and I think that's pretty powerful. Well, I don't actually think that the sanctions and subterfuge has failed. I think it's, in fact, to a great extent, succeeded. Because the Cuban Revolution has not been able to become what it could be. Imagine if there was no blockade. Imagine the kind of impact it could have had. The pharmaceuticals that it could have sold to the world, that it cannot. It's being blocked. Imagine the kind of agroecology that Cuba, along with the landless workers of Brazil, could have taken to the world. The landless workers of Brazil produced the largest volume of organic rice in the American hemisphere, much more than multinational corporations in Brazil. Imagine if the two of them had come together and been able to help other people, landless movements in Tanzania, such as Miwata or Zimsoft in Zimbabwe, if they had gone and helped build cooperatives and new kind of collective structures, could have been incredible. They would have helped usher in sovereignty movements around the world, food sovereignty movements around the world. So in one sense, there has been a success of the US policy. The failure is they haven't been able to overthrow the revolution, but they weakened it. During the special period, it was weak. If not for the election victory of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez victory, Chavez comes to Caracas. It's a very interesting meeting he has with Fidel after he wins the election. And he goes back on the plane with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. They fly back to Caracas together from Havana. And on the plane, Chavez talks to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and explains to him what he's doing. And one of the pieces of that conversation is about the lifeline. Venezuela is going to provide a lifeline to Cuba. And in a sense, the garroting of Venezuela is part of the revenge against Cuba. The United States well knows that if they can collapse the Bolivarian process, Cuba loses a major lifeline for energy. That's why I always find it perplexing where people are like, we defend the Cuban Revolution but forget the Venezuela process. Okay, well, but that's the end of the Cuban Revolution. The new attack on Claudia Sheinbaum, new president of Mexico, saying, she's a narco president. That's coming just because Venezuela is Mexico is one of the key suppliers of energy to Cuba in this period. They're keeping Cuba alive. So in that sense, I don't think it was a failure. I think they also tried an invasion, Bay of Pigs. They tried to kill Castro many times, but because of the example of Guatemala, the ghost of Arbenz is all over Cuba. The Cubans have built an intelligence apparatus that is not going to allow an easy overthrow of the country. That is not wilted at all. Under great pressure, they're very good at organizing their internal security. That's super important. Okay, the Yanks can fly bombers and bomb Havana and collapse the government. Yeah, but I don't think they're prepared to do that. The whole of Latin America would rise in rebellion if they did that. I mean, in Latin America, the support for Cuba is enormous. It often crosses into liberal centrism. They also support the Cuban Revolution. I live in Santiago, Chile. Even my miserable president Gabriel Boric supports the Cuban government. He hates the Venezuelans, but he supports Cuba because he can't think straight. And the thing is, it's when Gabriel I know him very well, I'm friendly with him, but one of the interesting features of Boric's presidency is I began to really reconsider this whole thing about the youth. We need more young people and so on. There's a lot said for wisdom and experience. And I think 38 years old is a bit young to become head of government. I think there needs to be some, I'm fed up with this sort of World Bank fetishization of the youth. You need more youth. Of course you need more youth. But, you don't say, let's jump over people with experience. Just because an older person doesn't know how to use a phone doesn't mean they're an idiot, yeah? They have experience. They can look at the long term. They understand the implications of something. They understand the importance of a certain kind of politics and so on. So it's not that US policy has failed. It's actually succeeded. That's why we want to fight the embargo. That's why we want to end the blockade. See, the US government is the most weird, strange thing because they'll say, we must do the embargo, the blockade. But then they say, Cuba is a failure because the government is a failure. So if the government is a failure, then lift the blockade. Then let the government fail. Why do you persist with the blockade? You can't persist with the blockade and say the blockade is not the reason why there's problems in Cuba. Yeah, so in that same way, we can't say lift the blockade and say the blockade doesn't succeed. The blockade is succeeding. It is hurting people. It is removing from the Cuban government billions of US dollars. So it's actually a hugely successful thing. Yeah. No, the BRICS is not going to help anybody. It itself is, people shouldn't get too excited about these things. They throw around terms like multipolarity as if the world has already changed. It hasn't. It's a process. It's going to take a long time. Lula just vetoed Venezuela's entry into the BRICS. That's a signal of where Lula is politically. He's great. He's heroic. But he has his limitations. In a sense, he has U-turned in this second term or third term to full-on social democracy. And in fact, he's authorized his finance minister to pursue a deeply punitive neoliberal financial policy. That's where the BRICS is. Indian government is a government of the right. Yeah, Russia is in the middle of a war. The Chinese are worried about the US bringing in nuclear weapons to Tyndall Air Base in Darwin, building, a submarine port in Fremantle, in Perth. Yeah, they are also worried. They think the US will smash them. They are worried about this new Cold War getting hot. Why is the Australians involved in it? I don't know. I really hope everybody is strengthening the peace movement in this country, because you're going to have nuclear weapons in at least two places, which go against everything that, the peace movement of an earlier generation fought for. Two places in the country will have nuclear bombs. It's not a joke, yeah? It's not a joke. I mean, it's a terribly scary scenario. So how can the BRICS operate independently? I mean, people say, why isn't China doing more to help the Palestinians? They're doing all the diplomatic things. But I don't think people recognize that in the Eastern Mediterranean, the United States has basically surrounded the coastline of Lebanon, Israel, and then down to Gaza with their fleet. If the Chinese or Russians or anybody tried to send a ship to go to Gaza with aid, they will stop it. It will be the Cuban Missile Crisis. They will block the ship. Yeah, it's not going to be easy. They are complaining that the Yemenis are trying to block the Red Sea, but they've blocked the Eastern Mediterranean. They only allow who they... See, if you remember the Freedom Flotilla, yeah, I mean, it was savagely attacked by the Israelis. They tasered people on board ships. And, you might say, well, they didn't shoot anybody. That's because they didn't want international incident. But they tasered and almost killed a man from New Zealand who was on that second flotilla, Freedom Flotilla. So it's not that the BRICS countries don't have a new understanding of the world, but nobody is prepared to confront US military force. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? They didn't want nuclear missiles placed in Ukraine. It's as simple as that. And now, the Germans, the Wehrmacht, is going to have a base in Lithuania with 4,000 Wehrmacht troops. First time the German military is going to have a foreign base. So this really blocks countries of the South from providing assistance and support. And it's frustrating. I want 10 Chinese ships to roll into Havana Harbor with electrical equipment. But they don't want to directly have frontal confrontation with the US. They're not ready for it. It'll take time. So we should never exaggerate things and hope that, they will come in and save the day. Right now, Russians, Mexicans, and so on are providing assistance. It's very important that we build these solidarity movements in a country like this. Because I think there's space in Australia for people to understand the importance of sovereignty. I think there's space here. I think lots of people will be attracted to the kind of defiance of Cuba. I'm always told that the culture of this country is a culture of defiance. Yeah, I also watched all those Mad Max movies and so on. Where is that defiance gone? Or have you all become the sheep that they imported to grow on the land? Who knows? I asked somebody in New Zealand, where is the they said, no, that's Australia. New Zealand, we were always sheep. That's Australia. They were defiant. I already went through the Lula thing in a way, but the second part of it about the new mood in the global South, it's true, there's a new mood. But that new mood mustn't be mischaracterized as power. There's not new power in the South. There's new mood, new attitude. Even the Indian government is kind of wavering on this whole Cold War on China. India was part of the Quad. Australia, Japan, United States, India, the Quad. Then India wasn't behaving well. So the United States started the Squad, which is Australia. Australia is a regular feature. Thank the Lord. Canberra, the Secret City. That's a great TV show. Did everybody see The Secret City? I really loved watching that. It was a great show. It's about this intrigue in Canberra over China and the whole Cold War thing. And I don't know, I enjoyed it. Many of you had never heard of it. Today I asked an academic who looks at these issues who had never heard of it. So I was like, wow, that's interesting. Maybe it's banned in Australia. Maybe they banned Secret City. Anyway, they have Australia, Japan, United States, and Philippines. That's a Squad. Quad is not doing the work, so now they have a Squad. There's a new mood. Some of these countries are just not willing to go along with US policy blindly. The attitude of the whole global South towards the genocide in Palestine. They're not willing to go along with it. But they can't stop it. And that's the difference between the new mood and a new power. There's no multipolarity. It doesn't exist. It's a hallucination. Don't exaggerate the world situation. We have a lot of work to do. If you start exaggerating the world situation, you'll become complacent. That, we'll just let the BRICS countries save the day. You've got to get to it, guys. We have a lot of work to do. You have to change the balance of forces in this country as well. That's why you've got to be part of these networks. You've got to join a network. You've got to be involved. Revive the old parties. Can't let them die out. Fidel didn't retire. He kept fighting right till the end. The grandma columns continued to come out of the old man right till the end. Yeah, if he can do it, we can do it. Right till the end. You got to change the balance of forces. It's not going to change for you. Yeah, the BRICS aren't coming into town, all guns blaring. They are scared of being destroyed, and they have a right to be scared because the United States is a super dangerous military power. 75% of world military spending is spent by the United States and its NATO allies. 75% annual world military spending. China spends 10%. Russia spends 4%. And your media is so bad that they take the 10% and 4%, that's 14%, and say the 14% is a threat to the planet. But the 75% is benign. Because they were benign to Iraq, they were benign to Libya, they were so benign in Afghanistan, you participated in that. Their violence is benign. When the Israeli bombs fall, it's benign, right? Because they don't kill anybody. The Palestinians kill themselves. You got to change the balance of forces. That's really important. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. Like, it's not going to change itself. Yeah? I've repeated that a couple of times. I'm trying to drill the point home. I don't know how to say it a different way. It's very old-fashioned language. Got to change the balance of forces, etc. That's another way of talking about the class struggle. It's still alive. You know, the great initiator of the class struggle is not the proletariat. The initiator of the class struggle is a capitalist system. It imposes a class struggle on human beings. It's not the proletariat. Proletariat goes on strike. That's not the beginning of the class struggle. They are responding to the structure. The class struggle is alive and well, whether you are fighting it or not. It is eating your soul daily. And the thing is that human beings around the world have decided not to engage the class struggle. Many countries, people are not out there battling to change the balance of forces. I'm going on this tear because it actually takes me very well to the next question, which is talk about meeting Fidel. Well, I met him several times, but my favorite meeting with Mr. Fidel Castro has to be in Durban, South Africa, during the World Conference Against Racism, because I got to sit with him in his hotel room for a very long time and listen to him tell me the history of the world. Because this guy knew a lot about a lot of things. And why it was interesting was, in fact, it's not true that that's what was happening, because the real fact is he wanted to know about the caste question. Because at Durban, this became a big issue. The issue of caste. There were some forces who wanted caste to be added into the other intolerances category, because it was a world conference against racism, xenophobia, and other intolerances. That was the official name of the conference. People have forgotten this conference because of bloody Al-Qaeda's planes crashing in the US, 9/11. Yeah, some of you will say there's no Al-Qaeda. It was all an inside job. I hope not, because that denies Al-Qaeda the agency. Arabs are able to crash planes. It's not the Americans that do things to themselves. This happened, I believe. But the World Conference ended on the 9th of September, 2001. And there was a huge process, fight, agenda, and 9/11 destroyed everything, because you couldn't advance the agenda of that conference. But at the conference, the Indian government was very upset that these forces were trying to introduce caste, and Castro was super interested. What is this caste system? He had been to India many times, very good friends with Indira Gandhi, but he really wanted to learn the intricacies. And I had been invited by Mary Robinson to talk about caste at the conference. And, you know, I'd given a lecture and so on to the assembly about the nature because my first book had been about caste. And so he grabbed me and said, come with me for my personal seminar. That's the kind of person he was. He just absorbed all the information. The next thing you hear is he turns to people and he's an expert on caste. That's endearing, you know. That's a revolutionary. You know, he's always bringing the good news to other people about knowledge. And that's why I always feel and tell young people, you got to keep reading and learning. Like to be a revolutionary, you have to know everything. You have to be able to fight the bourgeoisie on everything. You have to have a voracious appetite to know everything. Don't let them have the higher ground on anything. Read, learn, etc. Okay, how do we defeat the embargo? God knows. It's like it's just a shame in a way that countries like, your country or, other big states that operate out of size on the world system are unable to, because I think Australia, if I'm right, votes with the world in the General Assembly against the embargo. I think every year for the last 30 years, Australia has voted against. Just don't do anything after that. That vote will happen again, I think, in a few weeks. It'll be like 189 to 2. The 2 will be United States and Israel. Yeah? And, this year it'll be Argentina because of that amazing character, Javier Milei. What an amazing guy. This year, Milei's speech, if you haven't watched it yet, at the World Economic Forum, and then at the UN is one of his speech at the UN was one of the best, funniest speeches, because he accused the UN of being a socialist plot. But his speech at the World Economic Forum was incredible. It was about the danger to the West. And you think, man, you're from Argentina. Like, what West are you in? Your country is like 60% poverty. I don't know any West that's like you. But anyway, Milei is a nutcase. You're right. It'll be Argentina. Unfortunately for Argentina, are you Argentinian? I'm sorry about that. Yeah, you're gonna have to. Really, it's really tough. But all my Argentinian friends super demoralized, but fighting back. Yeah, what's his name? The governor of Buenos Aires, Kicillof. People are rallying behind Kicillof, saying he'll defeat Milei. Might be too late in a way because Milei is going to go back to the IMF. So whoever defeats Milei is going to have to deal with Mileiism for a long time. But yeah, this year there'll be probably 187 to 3. Country like Australia will vote against the United States, but do nothing. Not lift a finger. Like have the Australians ever, said the embargo should end, outside that vote? I doubt it. It's why maybe you should start a campaign saying Australia shouldn't vote against the embargo. The Australian government should in fact stand up for what it actually believes in. Yeah, it actually wants the embargo, so vote with the United States. Stop voting with the Cubans. Let's have you say what you practice. Don't say one thing and do another. Don't be a hypocrite. Maybe that's the campaign that the Australia Cuba Friendship Society should run. What's the name of the Prime Minister? Yeah, Anthony Albanese, yeah? Yeah, vote for what you believe, Albanese. Yeah, doesn't believe anything. That's the problem with a lot of these people, right? They don't really believe it. This afternoon I gave a thing about the far right of a special kind. And part of that was about the politicians who don't believe in anything, yeah? But in fact, they do believe in something. They believe that we are the enemy. They are all joined. Even though the left is weak, the left has to be continually crushed, even though it's weak. I was really happy that twice the New York Times wrote an article saying that I'm a paid agent of the Chinese government. I found that hilarious because firstly, they know it's not true. And anyway, if the Chinese were to give me money, I'd probably take it. But they haven't given me any money. But they know that. And so why are they bothering with us? Because we are irrelevant. Like, we are irrelevant. And by the way, just so I don't subscribe to our Tricontinental newsletter. This is a QR code. It'll come to you this week. It's actually about active peace and passive peace this week. And a great poem from Muriel Rukeyser about war, a great American communist. Anyway, Atul, I did it. So, but why are they afraid of us? Because we stand for things. We're sincere people. We have values. We are the inheritors of all the good values of the world. They hate us for that. They are hypocrites. They hate us because we remind them of humanity. They hated Castro. They hated him because he reminded them of humanity. He went to the conference at Rio. In Durban, because I was there at both the places, at the official government meeting and at the NGO meeting. He got a standing ovation in both places. Nobody else did. They hated Fidel. Fidel was like the world's conscience. He would come into the NAM meeting and everybody wanted to touch him. He was the conscience. They hate the left. They hate the left not for what we believe, but because we believe. Because we have faith in humanity. That's what they hate. Because these people don't believe in anything. I'm going to tell you, give you a little fantastic section from a play by Tony Kushner. He wrote a play called Angels in America. It's a terrific play. The first part became a movie, but the second part is my favorite. It's called Perestroika. It's very rarely performed. What I love about Perestroika is it opens in the last Supreme Soviet meeting. And when they are talking, the new leadership, those scoundrels, Gorbachev, and so on, the mark of the devil on his forehead over there. The great revolutionary, Anti-Diluvievich, the oldest Bolshevik in the world, stands up. And Anti-Diluvievich waves his finger at them. And he says to them, you Nep men, you puny pieces of whatever. He says, when we were young, we could see the horizon. And the horizon was a red sun. We saw the future. We had a theory. We had an understanding how we were going to build that. But you, Nep men, he's referring to the new economic policy of 1921. You Nep men, you puny pieces of garbage. You don't have a theory, he says. And then he says, even a snake, before it sheds its skin, grows another one. You, my little serpents, have no skin. Wow. That's how I feel when I'm confronted by these Albanese's and company. You serpents have no skin. You don't have a theory. You don't believe in it. That's why they hated Castro. That's why they hate us, actually. Even though, face it, we are basically irrelevant. We are not in the conversation. We have to try to get into we have to fight for it. We have to build power, build strength. But right now, we are weak. How are we going to break the blockade from our position of weakness? We have to fight to build the Australia Cuba Friendship Society, build all the various organizations, and all the organizations have to work together with the Friendship Society to build momentum. That challenges Canberra to do more than merely vote once a year against the blockade. Why doesn't the Australian government send relief and aid to the Cuban Revolution now? That's the campaign. Now. That's the campaign.
I might just interrupt briefly, just before we move on to the next question. I know everyone wants to maximise their time that we hear from you. So I'm just going to let you know that brief interlude is that Teachers Federation are hosting us for free tonight. And not only are they hosting us for free, but they've also paid the wonderful Nadia up the back, who is doing all of our sound tonight. We need to be out for Nadi by 9 p.m, doors shut. That's a hard line for him. So let's do that for him so he can go home. And let's take the Q&A to 8:45, and then if everyone could leave, then you can feel free to chat on the footpath. Okay, so thank you.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to see if anybody wants to ask a question from here, so we can hear a couple of voices for the next 15 minutes. Yeah? And if we can't, I have that. Yes, right in the back. I have no idea the name of the book, okay? But his name is Silvio Rodriguez. And his first 3 albums are epic. Epic albums. He has a song called Playa Giron, which is about the Bay of Pigs, which is superb. Yeah? You can get it all on Spotify, the worst place to hear music. But we're all stuck with these McDonald's of everything. I don't remember the name of the book, man. It was like a huge thing and it was a big pain for me. Because I didn't come to Cuba with a suitcase and I had to carry it in my, Sometimes I feel like that character who's always got little problems. It's my favorite television show of the last few years has been Curb Your Enthusiasm. Is it? Because I sort of sympathize with Larry David. Like, for instance, I get upset when I see people wearing shorts. Or if somebody comes into my house with their shoes on, I just start shaking. I don't know how to tell them to take the shoes off. I have all these little problems. So carrying a giant book under my arm on a small plane, I was worried about the imbalance of the plane. Anything else? Yes.
That's Rachel.
Yes, Rachel. Okay, Rachel Evans. Thanks for that. The Cuban people have been out on the street protesting. In fact, there was a big thing and Díaz-Canel led a big march down the central area of Havana into historic Havana. There's a part of, it's really quite beautiful, where there's these wooden cobblestones and so on. They walked through that whole area. What can they do? What can anybody do? Nobody has been able to even, we can't get through to the Israelis because it's not the Israelis doing this.
Can the UN do something about it?
It's the United States and the Israelis that are involved in this. Well, what can the UN do? They can't do anything. The United States will veto anything in the Security Council.
You can bypass that, can't you?
I don't think so.
I think it can.
I'll give you an example. In Libya, 2011, there was a civil war going on. The Air Force in Benghazi revolted to the rebellion. And they were doing dogfights over the Mediterranean. United States and its European allies, especially the hideous France, decided that there was a genocide happening in Libya. So they went first to the UN and passed a Security Council resolution 1970, which said no arms transfers to either side. Okay, they got a majority, resolution passes. A couple of weeks later, they go back to the Security Council and they get UN Resolution 1973, which was under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Chapter 7 allows any member state, is the language, to use military force to prevent any outrageous behavior. I've forgotten the rest of the Chapter 7. But most resolutions are under Chapter 6, which allows economic boycotts and things like that. Chapter 7 resolutions are very rarely put out there. Plus, they added on to that responsibility to protect, R2P. After the US illegally entered Iraq, the UN was very worried that that invasion of Iraq had delegitimized intervention to prevent genocidal behavior and so on. So the UN called a conference, which under the leadership of Kofi Annan, produced something called R2P, Responsibility to Protect. So Resolution 1973 on Libya came with both a Chapter 7 indication, that means you can use armed force, and R2P. And the United States and France, NATO, promptly exceeded the bounds of the resolution and destroyed Libya. That was not the resolution. They were supposed to enforce a no-fly zone. That was the terms of the 1973. They completely violated the resolution and nobody was able to challenge them after that. In fact, I remember as a reporter contacting NATO and asking NATO for evidence of their bombing runs. Because Amnesty International was interested in going on the ground and checking where they had bombed and whether there had been genocidal activity and who had died and so on. NATO's lead attorney, Peter Osborne, wrote a letter saying that this is a ridiculous witch hunt and that NATO never commits war crimes. So we will not give you any evidence. Nobody could do anything. Yeah, we published the letter. Nothing. They just refused to respond. Why am I saying all this? There's Jordan, which has spent billions of dollars buying sophisticated military equipment. There's Egypt, which has spent tens of billions of dollars a year buying sophisticated military equipment. There's Gaza. At no point has there ever been a conversation of a Chapter 7 resolution, which is very unlikely, or responsibility to protect, or no-fly zone. None. Egypt signed a peace accord with Israel in 1979, Camp David. Jordan signed a peace accord with Israel in 1994. Not once in this year have the governments of Egypt and Jordan threatened to tear up their peace agreement. I mean, the Egyptians could easily fly jets over Gaza. They could have done it from November last year. Tens of thousands of people's lives would have been saved. It's not that they don't have the capacity. We have a precedent in Resolution 1973. A precedent from Libya, which is like just the other side of Egypt. Gaza is this side of Egypt, Libya is this side. You have a precedent. A UN resolution is a precedent. You have the damn R2P conference document. Yeah? And then over here, you have the military capability of running a no-fly zone. They're not doing it because they don't want to antagonize the United States. They're scared of the US. That's why this is a US massacre. It's a genocide, not by the Israelis alone, but the United States. They have the whole 7th Fleet garroting that region. And the thing is, the whole world falls for these things. Biden walks around saying, we're trying to put pressure. Blinken arrives in Tel Aviv. The whole thing is a facade. In the end, they want to smash the Palestinians. Why? That's a long story. We don't have time for that now. Yeah. But the thing is, what can Cuba do in this context? If Egypt and Jordan, brother and sister Arab countries, cannot act to protect the Palestinians, how are the Cubans going to enter? You think this is Quito Conivale, 1987? How are they going to land Cuban troops in Gaza? Ansar Allah from Yemen would love to send a military detachment to go and fight against the Israelis. But how are they going to get there? You think the Saudis are going to give them safe passage? They get on a boat, enter the Red Sea, the US will flatten them. United States is the most vicious military force and the most vicious country in the world. And this country is in a Five Eyes agreement with that country and provides intelligence. And this country continues to provide intelligence through Pine Gap for everything, including the strikes on Yemen. The intelligence came from Australia, from Pine Gap. So, what are we talking about? What can Cuba or the ALBA countries do? What can you do? Because in a sense, this is a Five Eyes genocide. That's how I've always seen it. This is a Five Eyes genocide. Everybody's implicated. I was in New Zealand at a Palestine protest. I said it's your genocide. New Zealand is participating in it. New Zealand ships went and participated in RIMPAC 2024 with Israeli Navy off the coast of Hawaii this summer. So did Australian ships. It's a Five Eyes genocide, simple as that. So what can bloody Cuba do, man? We're talking about getting fuel to Cuba. How are they going to fuel a ship to go to? Yeah, man, the Yanks will just blow them out of the water. The grandma. chugging through the Mediterranean to its doom. How many of you belong to an organization? That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. I mean, I don't have any advice because this is my second day in Australia. I arrived yesterday at 3 in the afternoon. First day really, just about more than one day. I'd never been here before. I spent 5 days in New Zealand. That was extraordinary. I can't tell you anything about how to do anything. But what I can say is that there's a lot of you. And what I can also say is that a lot of you enjoy being involved. And the question is strategic. It's not for lack of people. It's always strategic and organizational. And how to create broad fronts, how to do all that. Every place has a different culture. You know what I mean? It's like, it would be ridiculous for me to say this is the playbook. Every place has a different culture. But if there are so many of you just in this room who are already organizationally involved, and I'm sure all of you know each other from Palestine rallies. I mean, there's like at least 10 Kofiyas here. Yeah, I'm sure you know each other from Palestine rallies, pro-Cuba solidarity work, and so on. I mean, there's got to be a way to change the balance of forces. Many of you are in unions. You know, I know unions are struggling as well. Precarious work is eating at the edges of unionism. Yeah, people are just not able to form unions in precarious occupations. People are frustrated, angry, depressed, and so on. But there's got to be a way, you know better than me, what the culture is and how to draw people in. But I would find it hard to believe you haven't had enormous pro-Palestine demonstrations. The question is where to take that momentum. You know, sometimes people are easy to mobilize, hard to organize. And mobilizations don't make history. You know, sometimes mobilizations can assist. But we've already seen the example in the modern period of, let's say, the Tahrir Square uprising. That was a mobilization. It just couldn't make history. The most organized force there was the Muslim Brotherhood. They took advantage of the situation and won the election. But they were not permitted to exist. There was a massacre against them. They were killed off by the military. Even some of our comrades supported the military in that crackdown, which I thought was really bad politics. But that was the situation. Mobilizations don't do it. You have to organize people into political organizations. And you know that. Many of you are already there in those formations. Yeah, it's from that formation that we give people courage and conviction to join us, to stay with us. Different people have different roles in our movement. Everybody can't do the same thing. We need committed revolutionaries to provide the space for people to get courage. You know, one revolutionary in a union movement can provide backbone for everybody there. You know, that's the power of, let's say, the Leninist project, is that you don't need everybody to be a revolutionary. The revolutionary is infectious. But we have to be there. We have to be present. We have to be confident. We have to have that theory. We can't shed a skin and sit in the sunlight getting burnt, not able to slither.
Thanks very much, Vijay. And thanks to the Red Ant Collective as well, who have been a dream team for organising this. So thanks very much.